Isabella had always been cautious with love. A quiet librarian with dreams of traveling the world, she never imagined falling for a man like Adrian. He was mysterious, charming, and dangerous, the kind of danger that had always repelled her. But when their paths crossed at a smoky bar one rainy night, she found herself drawn in by his intensity. He was unlike anyone she'd ever known. Adrian lived on the edges of society, making his way through the shadows of the criminal underworld. He was involved in smuggling, moving precious artifacts and black market items across borders. For him, it was a game of survival, a way to keep control in a chaotic world. But when he met Isabella, something shifted. He hadn't planned to fall in love. She was his light, his escape from the dark world he was used to. The months they spent together were intoxicating. He told her stories of faraway places, adventures she'd never dreamed of. And in his arms, she felt alive in a way she had never known before. Despite knowing what Adrian did for a living, she pushed those thoughts aside. She believed that their love could change him, that she could save him from the dangerous life he led. But love has a way of blinding even the most cautious of hearts. As much as Isabella wanted to believe in their future together, the cracks in Adrian's promises soon began to show. One evening, as they lay together after a long passionate night, he spoke of a plan, his biggest heist yet, one that could set them both free. He promised that it would be the last. After this, they would disappear together, start a new life somewhere far away. Isabella's heart raced with a mix of excitement and dread. She knew what this plan entailed: risk, deception, and violence. And yet, the thought of freedom with Adrian was too tempting. She convinced herself it would work, that they could escape this world and build something new. But that illusion began to shatter when the plan was set into motion. Adrian's associates, rough men she had only met in passing, began to visit their apartment more often, their conversations filled with coded language and veiled threats. Isabella could feel the walls closing in around her, suffocating her in a web of criminality she had no part in but couldn't escape. As the day of the heist approached, Isabella's anxiety grew. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, and her mind was consumed with fear of what would happen if things went wrong. And then, they did. Adrian's last job turned into a disaster. The authorities had been tipped off, and what should have been a clean operation devolved into a violent shootout. Adrian barely escaped, but several of his crew were arrested. He returned to their apartment covered in blood, his usual confidence replaced with a frantic desperation she had never seen before. That night, as they lay low in the small, dark apartment, Adrian's words haunted her. "We need to run. We have to leave now," he said, pacing back and forth. But Isabella had already made up her mind. She had seen the depths of his world and realized there was no way out. Not for Adrian, and not for her. The betrayal came quietly, in the dead of night. While Adrian slept, Isabella slipped out of bed and made a call. It wasn't hard to find the number for the authorities. They had been circling Adrian for weeks, just waiting for the right moment. Her hands trembled as she spoke to the officer on the other end of the line, giving them the details they needed to bring him in. She hung up the phone and sat in the dark, tears streaming down her face. She wasn't just betraying Adrian, she was betraying the love they had shared, the promises they had made. When they came for him, Adrian was silent. He looked at her, his eyes filled with shock, hurt, and betrayal. But he didn't fight. He understood. In those final moments, he saw the fear in her eyes, the fear that had always been there, hidden beneath the love. As they took him away, Isabella stood in the doorway, watching. The man she had fallen in love with was gone, replaced by a criminal on his way to prison. She knew she would never see him again, and as the sound of sirens faded into the night, she realized that she had not just betrayed him, but also the part of herself that had dared to believe in their impossible dream. In the end, love couldn't save them. Only freedom could. Isabella stood frozen in the doorway long after the police car had disappeared into the night. The silence that followed was deafening, a stark contrast to the chaos that had just unfolded. Her chest tightened as reality set in. Adrian was gone. And though she had made her choice, the weight of it crushed her. She had betrayed the only man she had ever loved, and now she was alone. The following days passed in a blur. The authorities questioned her, but they already had everything they needed. Her betrayal had been thorough. Adrian's contacts, the location of the hideout, even the plans for the heist. Isabella had given them everything. She told herself it was the only way, that if she didn't turn him in, they would both end up dead or imprisoned. But knowing it didn't ease the guilt that gnawed at her. Nights were the worst. Alone in their apartment, she was haunted by memories of Adrian. The way he smiled when they spoke of their future, the way he held her as if he could protect her from the world. And yet, in the back of her mind, she had always known that protection came at a price. Adrian's trial came quickly. It was a high-profile case, and the media had a field day with the story. Infamous smuggler taken down by a lover's betrayal, the headlines read. The courtroom was packed with reporters, eager to capture every detail of the man who had eluded the law for so long. Isabella sat in the back, hidden among the crowd, watching as Adrian was led to the stand. He looked thinner, his once piercing eyes dulled by sleepless nights. He refused to look at her. She had expected that, but it still stung. The trial was brief. With the evidence Isabella had provided, the prosecution's case was airtight. Adrian pled guilty, sparing them both the long, painful process of a full trial. The judge handed down the sentence, 25 years in prison, no possibility of parole. When it was over, Isabella slipped out of the courtroom unnoticed. She didn't stay to hear the judge's final words or to see Adrian led away in handcuffs. She couldn't bear it. As she walked through the cold, gray streets, the weight of her decision bore down on her. She had her freedom, but at what cost? Every step felt heavier than the last, as if the chains of her betrayal were wrapped around her heart. Weeks passed, and life went on. She tried to move forward, picking up the pieces of her shattered world. But the void Adrian had left behind was too deep. She couldn't forget him. His absence was a constant presence, filling every quiet moment with regret. One evening, just as the sun was setting, there was a knock on her door. Isabella's heart raced. She wasn't expecting anyone. When she opened the door, a young woman stood there, her face pale and anxious. "Are you Isabella?" she asked, her voice trembling. Isabella nodded, confused. "Yes. Who are you?" The woman took a deep breath. "My name is Julia. I'm Adrian's sister." The air seemed to leave the room. Isabella stepped back, stunned. "I didn't know he had a sister." Julia nodded, her eyes filled with pain. "He didn't talk about me much. We were estranged for a long time, but I've been following the trial. I had to see you." Isabella's heart sank. "Why?" "Because I need to know why you did it." Julia's voice cracked, her emotions raw. Adrian wasn't a good man, but he wasn't a monster either. "You loved him. Why did you betray him?" The question hung in the air like a blade. Isabella felt the tears well up in her eyes. "I didn't have a choice," she whispered. "He was going to get us both killed. I thought if I turned him in, I could save us." Julia shook her head, her expression a mix of anger and sorrow. "You didn't save him. You destroyed him." Isabella crumpled into a chair, sobs racking her body. Julia stood there for a moment, watching her break down before finally turning to leave. But just as she reached the door, she stopped. "He still loves you, you know," Julia said quietly, her back to Isabella. "Even after everything, he asked me to tell you that." And with that, she was gone. Isabella sat in the empty apartment, tears streaming down her face. She had her freedom, but she had lost the only thing that had ever mattered. Adrian's love had been her anchor, her reason to dream. But now, all she had left was the cold, hollow truth. Sometimes, even love wasn't enough to save them. Weeks passed after Isabella's encounter with Adrian's sister, but the weight of guilt only grew heavier. Julia's words echoed in her mind every day: "You didn't save him. You destroyed him." Returning to her work at the library, to the routine of her old life, felt impossible. Each morning became a struggle, and every night was a battlefield, haunted by memories of him. One morning, several months after the trial, Isabella received a letter. There was no return address, just her name written in neat, familiar handwriting. Her heart raced. She knew it was from Adrian. With trembling hands, she opened the envelope and found a short note. His words were simple, yet they cut deep. "Isabella, I know why you did it. I don't blame you. We all make choices, and yours was hard but right for you. I will always love you, even from behind bars. I won't ask you to wait for me or feel guilty. Just know that if things had been different, I would still choose you every time. Adrian." She read the letter over and over, trying to grasp its meaning. It was a goodbye, but also forgiveness. Adrian understood her, even when she couldn't forgive herself. Instead of bringing her peace, though, the letter only deepened her sorrow. Adrian could forgive her, but she couldn't. She had lost him, and a part of herself. Everything they had shared felt distant, like a dream slipping through her fingers. In time, Isabella decided she needed to leave the city. She had to escape the memories, the places that constantly reminded her of Adrian. She sold her apartment, packed a few belongings, and headed to the train station with a single suitcase. She didn't know where she was going, but it didn't matter. She just needed to start over. As the train pulled away, she watched the familiar cityscape fade into the distance, and for the first time in months, she felt a slight release. There was a new beginning ahead, though the questions still lingered. Could she ever escape her past? Isabella didn't know the answer, but as she clutched Adrian's letter in her pocket, she realized one thing: love and betrayal are two sides of the same coin. And sometimes, to gain freedom, you have to lose what you cherish most. She would never forget him. But now, she had a future to face, and no matter what it held, she knew she had to keep moving forward.